Okay. Again, thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. My name's Jonathan Cohn. I know some, but not all of you, and it's always exciting to see new faces. I'm the policy director with Progressive Massachusetts, and we're delighted to have the speakers that we'll have this evening to talk about the important issue on, I think, all of our minds of housing. That over the past few months, we've seen the kind of never-ending set of attacks from the federal government under the Trump administration on the many issues that we care about. In past months in these forums, we talked about that the kind of the attacks on public health and the attacks on healthcare. In upcoming months, we'll talk about things like climate and immigrants' rights, then under attack. We wanted to devote one, of course, to housing, as we know that in poll after poll in Massachusetts, housing is a top issue on the minds of voters, as our state is an increasingly unaffordable place for people to live. Uh, Focus on put this together tonight so we can better understand what are the impacts of what's happening on the federal level on Massachusetts, especially when it comes to different programs that we benefit from that might lose funding and other steps, and what can we be doing here, knowing that framing of the title of here in Massachusetts, where, as I like to point out, we have the third largest Democratic supermajorities in the country, as well as a GDP larger than the country of Sweden. We can and should be doing more. So we're going to learn a little bit about what the landscape looks like now, and what are some of the steps that we can take here in Massachusetts to both push back against what's happening federally and better shore up the goals of making sure that everybody can be affordably and safely housed in our state. I'm gonna bringing up Vicki DiLorenzo from MassBudget to talk a little bit of kind of give us some general landscape about where things stand on this issue. So Vicki, I'm gonna put you uh on spotlight. So Vicki, take as a note, you can take, let's say, like 7 to 10 minutes to talk a little bit about what are you seeing federally, and how does that impact a lot of, especially, let's say, around funding and other issues about being able to make sure that we're addressing the housing crisis that we face here in Massachusetts.
Great. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Vicki. I am a housing policy analyst at MassBudget, and we are affiliated with the national umbrella called the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities that has been doing a lot of really important research on these federal cuts and on federal housing policy in general. So, really happy to be here, and thank you so much, Jonathan, for inviting me. And we're going to spend most of the evening talking about, state policies, things we can do locally to push back. So, to open, I wanted to just offer some specifics around, what exactly is going on at the federal level. We know that in general, the federal situation is sort of defined by uncertainty and chaos, and we know that the things that are happening are not good. But I did want to just try to put a little bit of, specificity around what is going on so that we can make sense of it and navigate the conversation. And also try to put the scale of these cuts into perspective for Massachusetts. Um, so what we're, staring down if this budget passes, is cuts that are around 44%, about a 44% overall cut to HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development, and not listing individual programs, but just sort of speaking in terms of types of impacts. One of the biggest ones is going to just be, really dramatic cuts to housing assistance programs that help people pay their rent, right? So, one of the biggest roles of the federal government in housing is to run, the voucher program and to build and maintain public housing, and, subsidize the costs of housing on the private market for many people who would, likely be homeless without it. And so that safety net is, really under threat. I haven't checked the latest numbers, but when the Center on Budget analyzed this back in February, there were proposals. The House proposal would have cut as many as 11,000 vouchers from households in 11,000 households, so more than 11,000 people losing vouchers in Massachusetts. And to put that into perspective, Massachusetts is one of the only states that has its own voucher program run at the state level. And that entire voucher program is around 11,000, right? It's a little under that. So when we're talking about losing that many federal vouchers in Massachusetts, it's sort of comparable to just like wiping out our whole state level voucher program, which already has, it just a very high level of unmet needs. So that's, one thing. And then also want to note here that these funding cuts mostly are affecting these programs that help people pay for housing, but they also affect programs that help people protect their rights, right? So like fair housing centers, some of those have already lost their funding in Massachusetts. And so that is a resource, for everyone, right? And there was an update from the National Low Income Housing Coalition recently that HUD is also proposing to just rescind affirmatively furthering fair housing regulations altogether. So just noting that, this plays into the protection of everyone's rights, even if you don't have a voucher, even if you don't live in public housing. And so moving away from the housing assistance piece, there are also just, some broader impacts that we need to brace for that are not necessarily, housing line items in the budget, but are still going to really, depending on how they play out, impact people's ability to afford housing, our ability to build housing. And so, one of them is tariffs, right? So there has already been plenty of press coverage about how tariffs are resulting in increased construction costs that have impacts all throughout the system, depending on what type of housing you're building. If it's market rate housing, that likely means it'll be more expensive. If it's income restricted housing, it might be more difficult for the project to be viable, and it might just never get built at all. So the tariff piece is, increased costs depending on the size of the tariff. And then also, again, chaos and uncertainty, right? So if you're trying to plan whether to build something and this is the environment in which you're trying to do that, it's very hard. And, it's especially a problem here because we have such a deep undersupply of housing already. So we have a, deep shortage of safety net funding. We also just have a deep shortage of housing of really any kind. And so when we can't build housing, that puts more stress on the safety net programs. And it, puts more stress on the entire system, and it makes these safety net programs more expensive to fund. And then lastly, this is again still playing out, but the increased likelihood of an economic downturn is just something that is, having these ripple effects throughout the system, mostly again characterized by uncertainty. And, we don't really know what's going to happen, but there are impacts of that uncertainty that you can already observe. So our other great panelists can speak to some of this stuff in more depth, but that is just, my attempt to kind of break it down into something a little bit smaller than just, one big crisis, right? And so some of these harmful items, depending on what they are, might not take effect right away. Some of them are written to take effect in 2027. There's a small amount of time there to brace for those impacts for the state to do what it can to mitigate them. And there are still a number of, significant things that we can do locally. And something that I, in a way, consider a reason to be hopeful is that a lot of this local stuff is stuff that we needed to do all along. A lot of our housing crisis is driven by failures at the local level, to build enough housing, as well as, failures at the state level to, fund the things that we do fund, as far as the safety net goes, right? So that's, of course, going to be the main focus of the conversation, but just wanted to start there And I think that Mark is speaking next, so I will hand it
No,
off.
I'm having Mark go a little bit later, but I was going to bring up,
Okay.
uh, first of all, can we get a round of applause for Vicky? Thank you. And I've seen some questions in the chat. We'll do Q&A at the end, but I wanted to bring up Donna Brown-Rego from the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials. Donna, let me take Vicky off spotlight and bring Donna on. Talk a little bit about kind of what you're seeing from the work that you do, from about what we see coming down from the federal level, and a little bit about what we need to do here in Massachusetts.
Yes, great. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jonathan, for the invite. So my name is Donna Brown-Rego. I'm the Executive Director of the Massachusetts chapter of the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials. In the public housing industry, there's a lot of acronyms that we use. My organization is a member service organization representing the 240 public housing authorities across the Commonwealth. As Vicki mentioned, Massachusetts is one of only 3 states in the country that has state-funded public housing programs and a voucher program. So about half of our housing authorities are only state-funded. There are about 43,000 public housing units across the state and about 11,000 rental vouchers, which allow folks to take a voucher into the private market and their rent is subsidized. The other half also run federal programs across the about 120 housing authorities. There are about 28,000 families in federal public housing, and there are about 72,000 rental assistance or Section 8 vouchers. And just to put things in perspective about the need across the state, on the state public housing waiting list, there are about 300,000 people on the waiting list. And we have a centralized Section 8 waiting list with about 180,000 folks. And obviously, some people are on both of those lists. But looking at the proposal that just came out, the administration's FY26 budget, as Vicki mentioned, significant cuts. It's almost half of the total HUD budget would be cut if this went through as is. The other crazy thing that it would do is it would block grant the money. So that any of the federal money from HUD would now go to the states all in one big bucket. And each state would have to figure out how to distribute that. So all the money that's now being used for Section 8, for Section 202, which is elderly housing, disabled housing, there's about 3 or 4 different programs that will all have their own separate bucket, would now be in one big bucket, cut by half, and each state would have to figure out where they need to put that money and then try to figure out how to run it without a HUD. So that's a pretty frightening proposition. Thankfully, in Massachusetts, we have a bit of an infrastructure because we do have the state public housing program, and the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities runs that. But this is a pretty traumatic proposal. The other thing it would do is would put limits on how long people could stay on assistance. But at the same time, because I think this administration is all about getting people who are able-bodied up and out of these programs. But at the same time, they're proposing to eliminate a lot of the self-sufficiency programs that assist people in doing that. There would also be work requirements. And I think it's a myth to think that a lot of people that live in public housing or that have a Section 8 voucher don't work. But in reality, about 75% of everybody on the program in Massachusetts has a working person in the family. And just think about somebody who qualifies for Section 8, has a full-time job, possibly more than one full-time job, and they still can't make ends meet and to be able to get out and rent or buy in the private market, as hard as they're trying. If there is any bright side to this whole scenario, on the federal level, the Section 8 program, these HUD programs have always had bipartisan support. for many, many, many years. So this draconian proposal, as is unlikely to move forward, we're hoping. And the fact that it needs the supermajority or 60 senators to pass, that's probably working in our favor. It's a good thing that the proposal came out this early. So we're going to gear up our advocacy. Obviously, this is just the first step in the appropriations process. But housing authorities, for the last several months, since the FY25 budget continuing resolution came out in March, most of them have not issued any new vouchers. And the state program has been frozen too. So those numbers of people on waiting lists, as I told you, they're not going anywhere. There's not going to be any new vouchers issued as of right now until we see what happens. Housing authorities are preparing their policies and procedures. Nobody has had to terminate anybody off of these programs, but they have to gear up and make a plan if that was something that they would have to do. Right now, they're trying to just work with landlords. They're trying to tighten their belts and limit, as much as they can control their expenses in order to avoid taking anybody off the program. But for now, there won't be any new vouchers issued. So the plan here locally, what we're planning to do and what my association does is we do a lot of advocacy on both the federal and state levels. One of the strategies that we're talking about, and we have a group of housing authorities that are meeting every couple of weeks to talk about these things. One of the things is we want to kind of get these stories out there. We want to kind of dramatize the human impact of some of these draconian proposals. There's also an economic impact. We're going to mobilize these landlords. There's a lot of Section 8 landlords that count on this, these checks from housing authorities just to cover their mortgage. So we're going to mobilize not just the people on the programs or the people that run the housing authorities, but there's an economic impact in each community. There's landlords, there's lenders, there's developers, people that would be affected by these proposals beyond just the participants. We want to expand our advocacy. As people know, we have a very supportive congressional delegation in Massachusetts. We have a very supportive state legislature for our public housing programs. We want to expand our advocacy out beyond Massachusetts. We have a great representation on the Appropriations Committee from New England. But if this state block grant proposal goes anywhere, we want to motivate governors in other states and see if make them realize what this would actually mean. The administration is going to give them money, and with cutting these programs by half, homelessness is going to go up. I mean, it's already an epidemic in the country, but now it's going to be on the states to figure out how to find places for these people who are going to be kicked off these programs, even if these or even once these programs are eliminated. So mobilize some governors, get some key information out there so people understand exactly what this impact is, not just locally, not just on the state level, but across the country and other states. I think that was all of my notes. So.
Awesome.
And I'm happy to take questions.
Awesome. We'll do some Q&A on the end, but can we get let me put myself back on. Can we get a round of Zoom applause for Donna? And then let me bring up, I'm going to bring up Joel, Deputy Administrator from the Boston Housing Authority, to talk about kind of what you're seeing in the world of public housing administration.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Joel Wool from the BHA in Boston, and thank you, Vicki and Donna, who did a great opening on this to summarize the issue and for your ongoing collaboration on this. So at BHA, we are known often by the buildings we have in Boston, like a lot of large multifamily buildings, but we actually have even more vouchers than hard units. And the cuts that are proposed would be draconian and affect both the physical buildings and the operations and management of them, but also the many people living in the private market with rental vouchers. We've estimated that the proposed budget would result in us terminating about 8,000 vouchers. You heard from other participants about long waiting lists. That is also the case, certainly with the ones that BHA administers. So having that huge a cut would be catastrophic. I think this issue by itself, even without all of the other policies proposed around healthcare, around food assistance, or grants that are canceled, or school food being denied, right? Like this issue by itself would have enormous impacts, certainly on individuals and families. Um, you would see people be unable to pay rent. You'd see evictions spike dramatically. You would see the courts be unable to even process the volume. And then you're going to see what Donna referenced, which is an economic impact that is going to be, I think, quite calamitous all in itself. For existing housing, that dramatic cuts to rental assistance and rental vouchers would look like landlords first perhaps being unable to maintain their properties, those landlords with foreclosure with mortgages perhaps going into foreclosures. Then you have, banks unable to collect on loans, and you have a lot of proposed multifamily units that are subsidized by Section 8, where Section 8 is an essential part of them taking out a loan. So you start to see impacting large scale real estate development, the construction industry, the people who work in construction, and so on and so on. So the economic impact, it is, of course, it is a catastrophe for the individual families and households who have Section 8. It is just about that for the small landlords. To give you a sense, BHA owns property only in Boston. We administer vouchers in Eastern Massachusetts, but a good chunk of voucher holders do live in the city of Boston. The majority of our voucher holders do. Many of them, they live all over the place. But many of them do live in low and moderate income neighborhoods, and many of them do live in triple deckers or smaller housing forms. So the kind of housing that we serve in the voucher program in Boston actually looks very different from the profile of housing that we own. So you're going to see a lot of small, like not just residents of small properties kind of buried in the neighborhood that you couldn't distinguish from other adjacent properties, but also the owners thereof, in some cases the owner occupants thereof, really suffer dramatically. And the impact on the economy is going to be intense. And um, with regards to the public housing program, just on a good day, if you want to say, or on a in our normal state of affairs, we get about $35 million from the federal government in Boston to try to catch up on $1 billion capital backlog. So if you cut that in half, you are going to see an increasing strain on the ability to do things like keep roofs, literally roofs over people's heads, maintain elevators, maintain fire alarms, the basics of like having habitable property, right? Having a habitable home. So that is extremely concerning. But as a housing authority, we are going to try to keep people in place no matter what. Um, where we own the property. With the voucher programs, if the vouchers are terminated, or if we are forced to terminate vouchers, we don't have that same ability to sort of help preserve tenancies, and that's why it is such a catastrophic and immediate threat to many renters scattered in the private market. Because the economic impact on so many different parties is going to be that bad if this kind of proposal advanced, we do have some hope. And when you think about how do you fight back against difficult odds, you do have to do storytelling. You do need to build coalitions. In our case, we need a coalition that is, or an overlap of parties speaking the same or similar messages that is extremely broad, and it's going to be certainly all of the progressive elements of that, which might be affordable housing, it could be, labor communities, it could be others, but also all of the other parties who are deeply invested in this, because the reality is we need this to be an issue that is as high, like on the radar as it is of significance to people's lives, which is basically it's one of the most important and immediate issues for virtually every person, right? Um, but also, we need people who are maybe not of the same political constituencies to weigh in. And that's why, it doesn't matter whether you personally sympathize with a landlord or a banker or another or a financial investment entity of any other kind. But the point is that there is these proposals will hurt so many different people and corporations in different ways that there is the ability to kind of create a coalition or a Venn diagram of support for a different way forward that it may be possible to turn that back. So that is a small grain of hope. And what we're trying to do is make sure that individuals, legal services, certainly, progressive activists, et cetera, understand this, but also that yeah, the property owners, the company owners, the landlords, the small landlords, the big landlords, the lenders, like that they get it too, because we kind of need everyone speaking and, the so that any ear that's attentive, whether it is a progressive elected official or whether it is a conservative one, but who is having to listen to banks, right? Like everyone listening to and understanding how this is not going to work. So I think I'll stop there, but I can't stress enough how severe this would be. Certainly in the city of Boston, certainly in Eastern Massachusetts, certainly across the Commonwealth, and it's severe enough that in an unprecedented way, both BHA and the Commonwealth have been reaching out to participants in the federal voucher programs. To say this is on the horizon and it's very bad. And BHA, we've actually specifically asked landlords, not using any public monies to advocate, but we've asked landlords to start advocating.
Awesome, Joel. Thank you so much. Can we get a round of Zoom applause for Joel? Okay. Let me take Joel off spotlight. I'm going to bring up Mark Martinez from the Massachusetts Law Reform Institute. Mark, if you want to tell us a little bit about, because I know one thing I'll add on to what I was doing before, because I know MLRI does a lot of great work with people who are facing housing insecurity and kind of facing in need of emergency assistance. If you can speak to that landscape now of the what's at risk from federal cuts, as well as some of the policies that MLRI is doing great work in advocating for this session.
Yeah, sure. Hey, everybody. So yeah, I think there's a few things. I think we've already started to see some of the impacts. Like Joel and Vicki and other folks have alluded to, Mass having its own voucher and public housing program is really great, right? And it's allowed us to be more flexible and it's allowed our vouchers, in particular, to go a lot further than what traditional federal vouchers do and cover more costs and be a little bit more flexible. We've already seen the state kind of pulling back on some of those things that used to be able to do with vouchers, moving costs and other things like that. I think really in an effort to have as much money as possible, right, in anticipation of losing a lot of this funding. And I also think in anticipation of programmatic changes coming from the federal government, right? Because beyond just the money that we are losing, it's also, services and programs that we've been allowed to do. When we talk about cutting, the HUD budget by almost 50%, that has really bad implications on things like public housing and the availability of that. But it also, guts things like fair housing protections, right? The things that really protect us against discrimination and discriminatory practices in housing. And on another call, right, we can have a conversation about how effective fair housing has been up until this point, but it has helped. And it is still a really important thing to have and a really important tool kind of in the toolbox when we are fighting against, this housing crisis is not just one purely of of a scarcity of housing, though it's a big part of it, right? The other big part of this is like it's also a really racist housing system, right? And while most people are struggling to get by in the system, folks of color, in particular, Black people, low-income people in particular, are struggling and gutting services like fair housing at HUD, and removing some of the flexibility of our voucher programs here in Massachusetts are really going to cause harm to those families first and foremost, in addition to everything else that everybody has mentioned and why it's really bad for everybody, right? None of us are better off and none of us are safer if more people are unhoused in our neighborhoods. That's not good for the people that are unhoused, obviously, and it's not good for us. It doesn't lead to safer or healthier communities. And so yeah, we're seeing that, and we are unfortunately expecting more. I think in particular in the public housing realm, a lot of us are really scared about what's going to happen to our immigrant neighbors that are in public housing. And to be clear, public housing, at least federally funded public housing, is pretty challenging to get into for folks that are not documented or don't have a particular status, but it's not impossible. It can happen. And right, we're really worried about that being just completely stripped away. Obviously, immigrants have been a kind of key focal point of this administration. And so, we are constantly on the hunt for constantly on the lookout for what's going to be coming in terms of that. But in terms of what can be done, I don't want to just sit here and talk about all the bad things that could be coming down the pipe, because that doesn't make for a great call. And so I think there are kind of two buckets, right, of what we can be doing in Massachusetts, right? What are the things that we can be doing that are free or very minimal costs that are going to protect particularly low-income people? And then what are the ways that we can kind of get some of the revenue that we need to build affordable housing? Right. And because the ultimate impact of all of these housing money, all of this money being lost for housing, is going to be a worsening housing crisis, which means more expensive housing. And so, right, we need things like rent control, right? We need that regardless, right? We needed that long before the Trump admin. We'll need it long after the Trump admin. But we need things like rent control that will cost the state absolutely nothing to make sure that costs remain somewhat manageable and predictable for families. We need things like TOPA, right? The Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, that will help us preserve some of the affordable housing that we already have. I think a lot of these conversations are around building new affordable housing and building new housing, and that's incredibly important, and we absolutely have to do that. But preservation is a huge piece of this, and preservation is often a cheaper way to keep affordable housing. Preservation is cheaper than production. And then I think one of the big ones right now is the local option real estate transfer fee, right? In a world where the state might have to start spending money on places that they normally don't, and that could come out of housing, in a world where we aren't going to be likely seeing as much money coming from the federal government towards housing. The local option real estate transfer fee gives municipalities the opportunity to generate the revenue that is needed to build and preserve affordable housing. And this money can also, the money from the transfer fee can be used for things like vouchers and public housing, all this other stuff, right? There's a long litany of things, all of which are designed to create or preserve affordable housing. And so, I think, and there are other things, right? There's the Hero Coalition out there that I don't work directly on, but these progressive ways, right? These progressive ways of raising money in a progressive way to raise more funds at the local level, at the state and local level, to be able to build the affordable housing that we need. The transfer fee in particular really is, we all talk about this housing crisis and how we are all being hurt underneath this housing crisis. But the fact of the matter is, there are plenty of people profiting off of the crisis. And the transfer fee is a tool to be able to take a very, very, very small part of that massive profit, to go right back into communities, so that they can build affordable housing. I think in 2019 or 2020, the city of Boston put out a report on how much they would raise with their transfer fee. It was about $170 million a year. My guess is, I'm not a mathematician, but that's got to be north of $200 million a year now, right? And that money was important before the federal government started cutting funding to housing, and it's going to be even more important if the federal government continues to go down this route. And so I think there are things that we can do. Obviously, continue to fight back, continue to push back against what is happening at the federal level in whatever ways. I'm sure you all have been doing that. But it is not just a thing. I think that can feel really big and that can feel really daunting and that can feel really overwhelming to kind of take on this federal administration right now. But there are things we can be doing right here in Massachusetts to soften the blow and to make sure that we're still heading in the direction that we need to be heading in when it comes to building the housing stock that we need, and in particular, the affordable housing stock that we need, and protecting things like vouchers and public housing that are critically important.
Okay, so can we get a round of Zoom applause for Mark? Okay, and I'm gonna bring up everybody else for a bit, and I'm gonna ask a few questions of my own, and then we will take questions from the chat. So if you're kind of in the chat, feel free to start getting your question juices flowing, because I'll be taking them momentarily. One thing that came to my mind as I was thinking about housing is, so last year, our state legislature passed and the governor signed a housing bond bill increasing basically to like various, let's say, kind of authorization of funds for housing in Massachusetts. A lot of, let's say, capital expenditures for housing, at least, but this is my general impression, are designed to be matched with funding from other sources, so that that you can stretch funding further by putting up money to unlock different federal funds. What are the implications for what the bond bill passed last year can do, knowing that some of these sources of possible federal matching funds might be drying up?
Well,
And,
I can jump in if
yeah.
that's all right. So, one thing I just wanted to note, so I have other great folks who can contribute to this discussion too. So the Affordable Homes Act is really wonderful legislation in Massachusetts, and it's both legislation like policy as well as
Hmm.
bonding. Bonding is borrowing money. Typically, when the state generates capital revenue, it does issue bonds. The bond, or sorry, it issues a bond, it passes a bond authorization, right?
Hmm.
So that it allows the state to borrow money. It sets kind of a maximum, but the state still has to take that action, and to take that action, it needs the revenue to pay off the bonds. So the point of that is that we have a ceiling, not a floor, for what will be invested in. And the governor and the Secretary of Housing and or Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities will, and the ANF cabinet in Massachusetts will publish and update information on what the actual capital investment plans are and kind of what they actually expect to do on a periodic basis. But the reason I'm explaining all this is because, one, the state needs revenue in order to be able to actually issue bonds and pay those off. And if there is more revenue, you can do more. If you're going, you can either invest directly, or in bonding will remain an important way of financing lots of different capital projects. Um, you can choose to issue more of the bonds that you have authorized in concept. So the other thing about that is that if money is taken away from you, right, it's harder to justify authorizing bonds, because if suddenly healthcare costs that the state is on the hook for bloat, right, there's kind of two things that can happen. Either the state pays more for that, or people lose healthcare, or both, really. So it's both. We need more revenue in order to be able to both directly and indirectly, like either pay for the things or pay for bonds that pay for the things, right? Pay for the debt. But also cuts to all these different programs create other problems. We don't, a number of people on this call were, I think, instrumental or fought for the fair share and other kinds of legislation that were revenue creating. That is absolutely critical, as when we are, in financial crises, for making sure there is, first of all, status quo, at least on transportation and education, but also can move forward on critical initiatives in a variety of ways. We don't have that for housing. We have other sources that are very important, but we really need to be thinking about how to go to the next level. So there's things you can do. We're trying to be creative about public investment to lower the cost of debt so that there's more that are going into the projects and less going into lending instruments, right? But you at the basic, you need investment, you need revenue, you need tax credits, and you need for the state to be able to issue bonds. So it needs some financial basis for doing that. So I think we're going to see a lot of good things from the Affordable Homes Act, but the more that the state budget is constrained either by economic conditions or by the fact that the feds are with pulling funds or making economic conditions worse, um, or the some of the both, then it gets harder and harder to actually finance affordable housing or to live up to the frame, the ceiling of what is the bond legislation.
Before I ask if anybody else wants to tag in on that, seeing Enid in the chat noting about the $3 billion generated this year by Fair Share, can we get a round of Zoom applause for the Fair Share amendment from people? But anybody else want to comment on that question?
Yeah, so I'm happy to just comment briefly about this. I think that first, there's a bit of a difference between these housing assistance programs that are seeing dramatic cuts and something like the low income housing tax credit, that is a, primary tool for financing affordable housing. And it's a little bit different what's happening with the low income housing tax credit. There are some reforms that maybe are okay, but that's because, but not because, but it's coming along with these sort of deep cuts to our safety net. So that's to say that it does depend on, what exactly you're doing. But I think just something that, broadly we, probably need to expect is that it just becomes more expensive to build affordable housing, right? That if it's more expensive to buy materials, if it's increasingly difficult to, plan these developments, then it might mean that some of the assumptions about like how many units you can create with whatever subsidy per unit might need to be revisited. I'm hesitant to, go further than that because all of this is still playing out, and that's kind of the point, is that it's quite uncertain. But generally speaking, you have a mix of funding sources, and certainly federal funds are a significant part of that. It does, speak to the importance of raising these funds locally and at the state level, in a state as wealthy as ours, which I'm sure you will ask about in some of your other questions.
And thinking as it comes to money, so like at the current moment, our state House of Representatives and state Senate are negotiating the budget for the next fiscal year. Are there things in particular that you're particularly eyeing in the state budget for fiscal year 2026 that the people on this Zoom or people who watch this after should be making sure that they're contacting their state rep and state senator about?
Yeah, so I can share, and I know that MLRI also has a great analysis of the state budget. We have sort of complementary focuses on the things that we discuss. But just a couple of points. The budget right now is in the conference committee process, which is where things that are different between chambers are getting negotiated. And so it's kind of a narrower set of things at this point that can change. And so, with those, there's still some opportunities to see more funding for emergency rental assistance, the residential assistance for families in transition program. So that's a program where if you're on sort of imminently, at risk of losing your housing, if you have an eviction notice or at risk of foreclosure, you can get assistance through that. There's a $17.5 million difference where Progressive Mass has written this all up, so please don't feel like you all have to take notes on these numbers, but there's an opportunity if the Senate language carries that we would get another $17.5 million for that program. And that's really urgently needed. This is a program that at the time we published our analysis was only had a couple $1 million left in the budget. And so is, at risk of running out of money before the end of the fiscal year. There's also an opportunity to get, it's the House version, I believe, and Mark will correct me if it's not, on the mass rental voucher program that is just under $5 million higher. And that's important because, again, these are vouchers that help people pay rent on the private market. And when rents are going up, 8, 9, 10% a year, then that's what you need to do to keep a voucher program sustainable. And that's really hard. And that's a sort of symptom of how, other failures in our housing market, right? But those are two things I'll elevate. And then also, I'm sure Mark will mention broker fees and how there's an opportunity to get what I consider a pretty significant win on those. But yeah, those are a couple of things that we have been really focused on. There are also some things to be concerned about, but I think, I can speak more on that later.
Mark, since you were named directly by Vicky, do you want to talk a little bit more about this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo everything that Vicky said. I think that we should be watching really everything in the budget really closely. I think they are running with this line of, these really tough fiscal times. And I think to a certain extent that is true, right? Like I think if the feds are going to continue to cut money, obviously that's going to have to come from somewhere. I think we obviously just have to look very closely about where that comes from. And I don't think that should be housing. Now, maybe that's because I'm a housing attorney, and I get paid to think that it shouldn't be housing. But, I think housing, obviously, and I think part of the reason housing is, the number one issue in Massachusetts is it's at the core of everything else, right? If you care about education, you've got to care about housing. If you care about health, you've got to care about housing. If you care about immigrants, you've got to care about housing. If you care about public safety, you've got to care about housing, right? Like whatever it is, whatever population is that you care about, whatever issue is that you care about, those people being safely and affordably housed is going to be really central to that. And so I think, right, really across the board, we can't accept that this is the time for them to kind of draw back on housing programs, especially those geared towards the most vulnerable. The governor's version of the budget had some really bad cuts to rental assistance that I don't think the House or the Senate's adopted. So I'm not as worried about that. That's good. There's been the slow dismantling of the emergency shelter program in Massachusetts at a time when, if a lot of these predictions are going to come true, those services are going to be needed even more. And so really worried about that as well. Like Vicky said, some good news, I guess. Right, there is a potential. It does seem like, mandatory tenant paid brokers fees are on their way out in Massachusetts. I think there's a few different versions of the language out there, some better than the others. If you are advocating on this, the Senate language is what you want. Go tell your legislators or whatever to push for the Senate language of the broker's fee. It's much stronger language. And yeah, I mean, I think those are the big things budget wise. I think it's going to be watching what they do with the bond bill, as Joel referred to earlier, that'll be coming up later this year. And yeah, just, not accepting that the cuts that need to happen, or not accepting that like these big draconian cuts need to come to housing because of what's happening at the federal level, because it still needs to be our top priority.
Awesome. Donna or Joel, anything that you'd want to tag in about the kind of ongoing negotiations about the state budget?
Yeah, just briefly, I think any increases to the voucher program, because again, I mentioned those numbers on waiting lists. Right now, the state's frozen any issuing of new vouchers, so just expanding, putting as much more money to expand the Massachusetts rental assistance vouchers is huge. So
Awesome. And Joel.
No, I think I'll echo that. I think so one thing I'll note is that we have had a positive trend thanks to a lot of advocacy on the public housing the state public housing subsidy coming up a little bit over time, starting to try to catch up. And the governor, starting with the Affordable Homes Act, sort of embraced the sort of capital investment, and then we are trying to keep inching that up on the operating side as well. So I think that's an annual thing just to keep going. And for the governor to propose increases, I think is a shift in thinking where typically the House of Reps or the Senate had to kind of come in and get that number up a little bit. So we sort of need all parts of the triangle to be pushing housing funding up. It's just that it's not going up quite fast enough. So we got to keep working on that, particularly in the context of other things dropping away.
I'm gonna pull up a few questions that I'd seen in the chat. So, kind of Judith Black in the chat earlier had noted that her local legislators are not supporting rent control because they fear it will dissuade developers from building, and say that they'll support expanding vouchers instead. Thoughts on this? I know, Vicki, you've done a lot of research on this issue. So
All right, Vicki, you can go first.
Yeah, so I think there are sort of two levels to this, right? It's, what is the answer, the sort of data-based answer to that question, and then, what else should you say to your legislator, right? So there's been a lot of research done on the effects of rent control on the supply of housing. And it's, especially modern rent control policies that typically exempt new construction, have really no significant negative effect on the construction of new housing. That, decisions about whether to build housing somewhere are driven much, much more by just whether there's demand for housing there, whether the zoning is restrictive or not, like literally whether you can legally even build it there, right? And so I can share some links in the chat about that, but the sort of short answer is that that's not really what the data shows in terms of the impacts of rent control. What I would also say is that whether it's through rent control, increased supply, or ideally a combination of both, like it really has to be a combination of both. If we do not get in a for-profit system, if we don't get rents and housing costs under control, then these voucher programs are going to be put under so much stress that they will not be sustainable. And so, when a legislator says, well, I don't want to, regulate rents, I only want to put more money into vouchers, we need to put dramatically more money into vouchers than we currently are. I want to be very clear about that. But if we don't get housing costs under control, then we will be constantly trying to keep up with a goalpost that we can't meet. What I would also say is that ultimately legislators make decisions in large part also because their constituents care about something and they care enough to follow up multiple times. So there can sometimes be this feeling like, oh, I have to win this policy debate with my legislator and I have to, address every point. And I mean, obviously that's helpful, but you should also just say that, it's important to you that people don't get gouged on their rent and that, when we see people who are having their rent raised 20-30% in a single year, that's not because some sort of underlying cost is going up 20-30%. That's happening because it's people are doing that because they can, right? So ultimately, MassBudget has endorsed the rent control legislation. Mark is working very closely with that coalition on it, and we are as well. It's something that really if we don't get rents under control, then we won't be able to have these programs in the future. And yeah, it's also just it's rooted in making the system more fair and not having a system where because there's a shortage of housing, a bunch of low-income people every year have to worry about whether they can afford to live where they do. So Mark, please, take it from there. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll echo everything Vicky said, and I'll just quickly say, right, like vouchers and rent control are not like substitutes for one another. That's not right. Like in maybe if we were having this conversation like 30 years ago, vouchers and rent control maybe could have been substitutes for one another. But at this point, right, I think in a world where the rent is already so high, like even with a really strong rent control policy, it's good. We need it. It's incredibly important and it will help to stabilize people. It's not going to magically create affordable rents for folks, right? Which is what vouchers are set to do. And so I want to make sure that those are just like those are separated out. And also, I'm just going to be very frank because it's 8 p.m. and I'm not on the clock anymore. No legislator, any legislator that says that better be out there filing amendments to greatly increase the line item for vouchers, which none of them are doing, right? None of them are fighting for these massive increases to the MRVP line item. So like that's like a BS answer to me. And then the other thing that I'll say, just without getting into way too much more detail, and we can send resources. Well, me and Vicki and I have them. There's also just no evidence, no research to support this idea that like rent control stops development. Right? We know the things that slow down development. It's onerous zoning. It's really high costs of materials. Interest rates, those are the things that prevent building. It's not rent control. It's not been true anywhere that it's happened. And so yeah, that is what I would say. Those are not substitutes for one another. I think they are companion pieces until we build the amount of affordable housing that we actually need.
Also saw in the chat that Meg Alfani had asked, is there some way we could get a breakdown of the effects of these cuts? What kind of, let's say, the waterfall effects of them to use for social media or when speaking with different stakeholders? If any of you can speak to any resources that kind of compile that information or present it particularly well.
The National Low Income Housing Coalition is, from what I've been seeing, putting out updates basically daily. And certainly check the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. I'll put our link in the chat. But the reason I mentioned Low Income Housing Coalition is just because their updates are extremely frequent. And so if that's the kind of information you're looking for, then that's a good one to add as well.
Awesome, thank you. One thing I thought it would be fun to ask people, what is the biggest myth that you want to debunk about the housing world in general that you routinely hear when engaging with either stakeholders, legislators, the public?
Go ahead, Donna. You came up first, so go for it.
Okay, Donna, go.
Go, Donna.
Well,
go, Donna.
Just quickly, I mentioned it in my remarks. I think there's a misconception that people that are on receive these assistance from these programs, whether it's a voucher or they're living in public housing, don't work, don't want to work, aren't motivated to get up and out. I think that that's a huge misconception. Obviously, there are a lot of seniors that are living longer. Housing authorities provide a lot of resources and the ability to have them age in place without having to go into expensive long-term care, which also saves the state a lot of money. But I think, and there's disabled folks, obviously, but, I don't know the exact statistics, but I was talking with the Cambridge Housing Authority this morning. He said about 90% of his folks on his programs have someone in the household, at least one person that's working. So I just think that that's something that the general public might not realize is the truth. Thank you.
And Mark, you look like you were about to jump in too, so Mark, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of them. I think Donna's is a fantastic point. In general, big picture, right, is this idea that as long as we are building something, right, is like basically this idea that like even if we're just building market rate housing, that will be enough to get us out of this crisis. And that's not true, right? And I think especially in this world of like reduced funding, people are going to turn to that. People are going to turn to like removing more barriers to private development as the solution to this problem. And I want to be clear, I'm a big fan of removing barriers to all forms of development, private or not. And I'm not saying that we don't need to build any market rate housing, but we have to be really, really intentional about making sure we are building affordable housing designed for low and even middle income folks at this point because of what the cost of housing is. And so we have to be really intentional. All right, private developers, we're not going to provide private develop our way out of this crisis. And so we need these government interventions, whether that's policy or money, because we have to be building it for the people that need it the most.
Vicki or Joel, either of you want to comment?
I think I mean, these are so good, right? So, like, let me just say, I'll say briefly as an echo on the work requirements one. It is particularly important to lift that up, and thank you, Donna, for doing so, because there are proposals that are trying to take work requirement experiments and make them into formal policies that are across the board. And we know that those don't work, and it will be like administrative overhead increases, poor people are disadvantaged or kicked out of housing, right? So that's like it's the worst of all worlds. Like it doesn't, and it so that's I'll note that just to expand on Donna's point, it's really important in this moment to try to avoid that kind of draconian policy. I think like um, I think that uh, two myths. I'm going to throw in two more here really quick. One is like why aren't things being built now? So in some cases it is because of zoning restrictions, but and we do really need to pare those back. But it's also just it's so heavily interest rates for the large multifamily development that if you want to really influence that, you can add subsidies or you can reduce borrowing costs, which you can do through public policy in various ways, but like you have to be aggressive. So the city of Boston, the state of Massachusetts, Mass Housing are trying to do things in this direction, but it does require some upfront investment to kind of create products that allow for multifamily, low income, multifamily, mixed income things to kind of come online at lower costs, right? So that's an important one. The other one that I'm going to throw out there is some people are like, I hear it's not about money. No, it is about money. It takes a lot of money to do a lot of the things we need. The problem is that it's about many decades of disinvestment in older housing. So we need a lot of resources to preserve that. And you know, even if you really like, we're gonna, yes, we eliminate zoning, we get rid of labor standards, whatever, we get rid of environmental standards. Construction would still be expensive, so we we have to do all of the things, we really do, and you pull on the levers you can control. But I think pushing for more funds, relaxing some controls, and trying to get, and preventing draconian cuts are like really, some basic good things we can do to push forward and push back.
Vicki, anything you'd want to tag in with?
Sure. So this is a recent one, but I think biggest myth that the myth that I've spent the most time thinking about in the last year is the myth that bond bills are actual hard money investments. So I put this link in the chat about 15 minutes ago. About the housing bond bill that we passed last year. And I want to just first start by saying it was much bigger than prior ones. And there's a lot of really good stuff in there. So this is more about how much further we have to go than about that bill sort of, having problems, right? But one of the things that we want to be really clear on is that a bond bill is not the same as like a budget, right? Or like an operating budget. So when the state passes a 60 something billion-dollar operating budget, that is assuming that all the money gets spent throughout the year, like those are actual investments, and that is the amount of money, right, that got invested in various public services. the amount of money that gets authorized in a bond bill is more like a ceiling. And then everything in the bill is kind of like a menu. Like there's, $5 billion of total bonds authorized. There's $2 billion authorized for public housing. There's $3 billion total across a range of other things. Um, you could, I'm being a little bit funny by saying this, but you could write like $1 trillion bond bill because all you're doing is saying, well, in theory, we authorize this much spending. There are other like very real constraints on how much of that money can actually get spent. It means that, depending on how much our ability to borrow each year increases, it it'll probably be maybe about half of that $5 billion that ultimately gets spent, maybe a little more than half. And that is because we have limits on how much debt we can take on as a state, and they are much tighter than how much debt the federal government can take on. And what it basically means is that the investments in the housing bond bill from last year are meaningfully larger than what they were in the last one, and they're going to do a lot of good for a lot of people, but that we just need to be honest about the scale of the crisis and how much further we have to go. And then just to, piggyback on Joel's point about revenue, like the state needs to balance its budget. That's how budgeting works at the state level. And so there, legislators can say, that they support everything, right? I support fully funded vouchers. I support fully funded public housing, fully funded RAP, fully funded everything. The real question is, are they willing to support raising revenue to fund those things? Because if we do not raise revenue to fund those things, we have to either defund something else or they're just not going to end up materializing. And so that is the myth that I have been thinking about and talking about the most over the last year. So we should be, happy that we are seeing these increased investments. But we should also be really clear about what bond bills do and what they don't do. And, what I think that means for sort of someone in the community who just wants to advocate for good policy, like really, emphasizing to legislators that like you support the state raising revenue to fund these things that we need. There is a really, widespread assumption by legislators that if they raise a tax, people are going to be mad. No one likes tax, whatever, right? And that's not true. And to the extent that maybe some people feel that way, it's MassBudget's role. It's, probably like a lot of us as individuals feel it's like part of our role to persuade people that that's not how we build a civilized society, right? So anyway, that is, my kind of, that is my take on, sort of myths floating around in the housing world right now and how we need to respond to them.
Awesome. So there've been a few, because I want to wrap us up. There are a few things in the chat that I'll send to all of our speakers if they can address later. My final question for all of you is, what should the people on this Zoom or watching this later do later this evening or later this week to help advance the goal of housing for all here in Massachusetts? Well, if you could suggest one thing for them to do. Who wants to go first?
Call your legislators and tell them to support the local option real estate transfer fee bill.
Who wants to go next? Vicki.
Yes, I was going to say please do call your legislator and ask them to support the local option transfer fee bill. We didn't get into the weeds on it tonight, but it can raise quite a bit of money for the affordable housing that we need. But also do make a call if you can about the budget pieces that are still in flux right now. It's, in some of them it's not as much money as we need or deserve, but it is money that, it's not as much money as we deserve, but it's money that we very much need. And especially, I think we deserve as a state to have a meaningful restriction on forcing tenants to pay broker fees,
Mm-hmm.
which again is something that doesn't cost the state anything. So
Mm-hmm.
yes.
Donna and Joel. Let's see, Donna unmuted. Go.
I was just going to say generally, and I'm sure most of the people that are supporting this group already do advocate, but if you don't, pick up the phone and email your state representatives and senators, and also on the federal level, just don't be intimidated by, you know, addressing some of these issues, even if you don't have all the details. Just let them know how important housing is, and the people that are supported by these programs really affect everybody in the community. And as Vicki said, it's part of being in a civilized society, and things are going crazy. So just keep advocating and the squeaky wheel, I believe.
Joel, one thing that you'd say for people to do after they leave.
Yeah, I think I agree on the state one. You could put in one email and call with the budget, and I agree with the transfer fee asks, right, on those items. I will just add on the federal scenario, take 30 seconds to think about, do you know someone in another district or state, whether it is a family member or you're like, oh yeah, my mortgage lender moved there, and like if it's
Mm-hmm.
someone who is like you or someone who's not, and just take a few minutes talking with them about like, no, this is a really serious thing that affects all of society right now. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I think anything we can do on the federal picture, it's like it is possible to beat back some of the worst items, and so take a moment to think about, is there someone somewhere in your network that you could mobilize to make a call?
Awesome. Well, can we get another round of Zoom applause for our speakers this evening? Awesome. Thank you all again. If you are on this, you will be getting the video recording from this, as well as some follow-ups for how to take action in the ways that all of our speakers spoke about. And thank you all again for joining us this evening. And we will hope to see you both on Zoom and in the real world soon. Have a great evening, everyone.